It was supposed to be a quiet morning. The kettle was boiling, the radio humming softly, and I was finally learning how to live in silence again. Then the phone rang. Once, sharply, like a cut through calm air. I almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end changed everything. My son's name, the word car, and the phrase, "We found something." I didn't hear the rest. My hands shook. My heart forgot its rhythm. You never expect peace to end with a single sentence. Well, I'm glad you're here. If you're watching this, please like the video, subscribe. The phone rang just as the first light touched the curtains. I hadn't slept the whole night. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your chest until you feel it in your throat. When the ringing started, I thought it was another wrong number or some distant relative calling to offer words I didn't need. But when I picked it up, the tone on the other end wasn't casual. It was official, careful, too calm to be normal. The officer's voice said my name slowly, as if confirming I was still real. Then came the words that stopped everything. "Ma'am, we found something in your son's car." For a few seconds I didn't breathe. The sound of the refrigerator buzzing in the background suddenly felt too loud. My son's name and the word car collided in my head, but I couldn't form any clear thought. He had been missing for days. The police had stopped calling 2 weeks ago. Everyone said I should accept that he'd probably run away again, like he always did when things got hard. But a mother doesn't stop expecting a knock at the door, a text message, or even a shadow that looks familiar. Now there was something in his car. The officer didn't say what. He didn't say if it was good or bad. He just asked me to come to the station and bring identification. His tone gave nothing away, which made it worse. I asked nothing, not because I didn't want to know, but because I couldn't speak. When the line went dead, I just sat there, phone still in my hand. My tea had gone cold. The sunlight on the table looked wrong, too bright for a morning that had already broken something inside me. For a long time, I just stared at the wall clock. The second hand ticked in small, cruel circles, counting a time I couldn't feel. I tried to stand, but my knees shook. I leaned against the table and waited for my heartbeat to catch up with the rest of me. People talk about grief like it happens after the truth. But for me, grief started the moment I heard the word something. That word held everything: hope, fear, guilt, all tangled together. Something could mean a phone, a letter, a wallet, or a body. I looked around the house. The coat he'd left on the hook, the empty chair where he used to eat, the small dent in the carpet where his shoes always stood. Everything looked normal, but it wasn't. The air felt like it was holding its breath. With me. I picked up my keys and my purse. My hands moved automatically, the way they had when I used to prepare his lunch before school. My mind wasn't really there. I just knew I had to go. The drive to the station was long. The streets were waking up. Joggers, buses, delivery vans. The world was doing what it always did, completely unaware that mine had paused. Every red light felt endless. I didn't play music. I didn't cry. I just kept replaying his voice in my head the last time we spoke. Casual, distracted. Like there would always be another day. There are some words you'd give anything to hear again, even if they were careless. By the time I reached the station, my palms were wet and my mouth was dry. I parked, sat still for a full minute, and told myself to breathe. The officer at the desk recognized me immediately. He didn't smile. He just nodded and told me to wait. That was the worst part, the waiting. The hall smelled faintly of coffee and paper. People came and went, talking in low voices. None of it reached me. My whole world had narrowed to that one sentence. We found something. I didn't know if I wanted to see what it was, but I knew I had to. When they finally called my name, my legs felt heavy. Every step toward that office felt like walking into a storm I couldn't stop. Whatever they had found in his car was waiting behind that door. And I knew, whether it was a clue or an ending, it was going to change everything. I took one deep breath before they opened the door. I told myself I was ready. But no one ever is. Before the phone call, before the fear, there was pride. A mother's kind of pride. The kind built from years of watching a child grow taller than the mistakes that tried to shape him. My son had once been that kind of child. The quiet one who brought home medals from school, who fixed broken radios with bare hands, who told me he'd make life easier for me one day. I believed him. For most of his life, I carried that belief like a shield. I thought it meant I'd done something right, that he'd turned out strong because I was strong. But somewhere along the way, strength turned into distance. When he finished college, everything started to change. The boy who once called me every night became the man who only texted on weekends. At first, I didn't mind. It's what mothers tell themselves, that independence means success. He got a good job, started dressing better, driving fast cars, talking about clients I'd never met, and deals I didn't understand. He moved to a bigger apartment and promised he'd visit more often. He didn't. I tried to convince myself he was just busy. Everyone's busy, I thought. But the truth is, he was busy becoming someone I barely recognized. He started talking about money like it was air, something you couldn't live without. I remember once asking him if he was happy, and he laughed like I'd asked something childish. "Mum, happiness doesn't pay bills," he'd said once, and even though I told him I understood, I didn't, because I'd built my whole life on things that didn't cost a cent. Honesty, peace, time at the dinner table. As the years went on, his visits became shorter. He'd arrive late, leave early, and spend most of the time on his phone. Sometimes I'd hear him arguing with someone, voice low, sharp. I never asked. Mothers always notice, but pretend not to. It's our way of protecting the illusion that everything's fine. Then came the money. He started lending me envelopes of cash for repairs or groceries, even though I didn't need them. "For emergencies," he said. I didn't ask where it came from, but deep down, I knew it didn't come from anything honest. The tone in his voice had changed. Too proud, too certain. The distance between us wasn't just physical anymore. It was moral. I could feel it every time he looked away when I spoke about his father, or when he changed the subject whenever I mentioned family. He wasn't running from me. He was running from who he used to be. Then one day, he stopped calling altogether. It started with silence, no texts, no messages, no visits. I told myself he was traveling for work. But when 2 weeks turned into a month, and a month turned into 3, I knew something wasn't right. I called his friends. Most didn't answer. The ones who did said he'd been busy or keeping a low profile. One even said, "He's fine, Mrs. Turner. Don't worry," in a tone that only made me worry more. When I went to his apartment, the door was locked and the mailbox was full. His car wasn't there. His neighbors said they hadn't seen him for days. I called the police. They filed a missing person report, but they didn't sound hopeful. Adults disappear all the time, they said, sometimes by choice. That sentence tore something inside me. They made it sound like disappearing was normal, like it didn't matter to anyone but me. Days turned into weeks. I stopped cooking properly. The house became smaller, darker. His room stayed exactly how he left it. His old trophies still lined the shelf. The smell of his cologne lingered faintly on his old jacket. I used to sit there sometimes just to feel close to something that still carried his shape. When the police stopped calling, I stopped expecting, but I never stopped waiting. There's a difference. Expecting hurts. Waiting is quiet. So when that phone rang that morning, it didn't sound like news. It sounded like memory coming back to life. I wasn't ready for what they'd found. But in my heart, I already knew that whatever it was, it would connect the version of him I used to know with the man he had become, and the mother I still was, sitting in a kitchen too empty for comfort, waiting for a door that hadn't opened in months. That's the cruel thing about distance. You never notice how wide it gets until something crosses it, like a phone call or a box, or the sound of your own name said too gently by a stranger. And that's when you realize you didn't lose your child overnight. You lost him slowly, in moments small enough to ignore, until silence was all that was left. The drive to the police station felt longer than it ever had before. Every traffic light seemed to stretch into minutes, every sound outside the car too sharp. My fingers kept tightening on the steering wheel until my knuckles hurt. I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of what they'd tell me or of what they wouldn't. Silence is worse than bad news. It lets your imagination do the damage. When I finally pulled into the car park, the building looked ordinary. Glass doors, gray walls, people walking in and out with files in their hands. But for me, it felt like the edge of something heavy, something final. I sat in the car for a while, watching my reflection in the rearview mirror. I didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her eyes were swollen, her face lined with sleepless nights. She looked like someone who had spent too long hoping for something that would never come. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and damp paper. The officer at the reception looked up when I said my name. He nodded, told me to wait. That word, wait, had followed me for months. I'd waited for calls, for sightings, for any trace of my son. Now, I was waiting for an answer I wasn't sure I wanted. After what felt like hours, another officer appeared. He asked me to follow him. The corridor was long, fluorescent lights humming overhead. The sound of my shoes against the tiled floor echoed like I was walking into a courtroom, about to hear a verdict. He led me to a small evidence room. Metal shelves, brown boxes, sealed bags with tags hanging from them. The smell of dust mixed with something sterile, almost cold. On the table in front of me were 3 objects: my son's car keys, his worn brown wallet, and a small velvet pouch. For a moment, I couldn't move. The keys looked familiar, scratched, the silver ring slightly bent. The same one he used to twirl around his finger when he was nervous. The wallet was the one I'd given him for his birthday years ago, still marked with a faint crease on the corner. But it was the pouch that froze me completely. It was mine. A deep, heavy memory hit me all at once. That pouch had belonged to my late husband. He'd used it to keep small things safe: a wedding ring, an old coin, a photo folded to fit inside. After he died, I gave it to my son. I told him to keep it as a reminder of where he came from. I'd last seen it, months ago, sitting in the drawer beside his bed when I visited his apartment. Now it was here, under bright police lights, tagged as recovered evidence. The officer explained they had found the pouch in the back seat of his car, tucked under the floor mat. The car itself had been abandoned near the outskirts of town. No fingerprints other than his, no sign of a struggle, no blood, No clear answers. He said all this with the same tone people use when explaining the weather. Factual, detached. But for me, every word was a punch. My mind ran wild, trying to connect dots that didn't exist yet. Why would he leave it behind? Why hide something that was never meant to be hidden? I leaned closer. There was something inside the pouch, a shape pressing against the velvet from within. The officer hesitated when I asked to open it. Then he nodded. My hands trembled as I pulled the drawstring. The pouch felt heavier than it ever had before, as if it had soaked up every unanswered question from the last few months. Inside was a folded piece of paper. My son's handwriting covered it. For a second, everything around me disappeared. The hum of the lights, the officer's breathing, the distant phones ringing in other rooms. All I could see was his handwriting. It wasn't long, just a few lines, but my eyes couldn't focus on the words yet. My throat tightened. The air in that room felt thin, almost unbreathable. That small piece of paper, lying beside the keys and wallet, was the only bridge left between the boy I raised and the man I'd lost. I didn't know if I was about to find closure or collapse, but I knew this much. Something in that pouch was waiting to change everything I thought I knew about my son. And as I stood there, staring down at it, my fear started to turn into something else. A kind of readiness I hadn't felt in months. I came there trembling, afraid of what they'd found. But deep down, a part of me already knew. Whatever was written on that paper wasn't going to end the story. It was going to start it. The moment I saw that velvet pouch, everything inside me shifted. It wasn't just an object. It was a piece of memory that had survived through time. Something too personal to ever belong on a police evidence table. That pouch had traveled through decades of our family's life. I could still remember the first time I'd seen it in my husband's hands, long before my son was even born. It was small, dark blue once, though years had dulled it into a soft gray. My husband used to keep his most private things in it. His father's old watch, a coin from his first paycheck, and a photo of the two of us from the day we moved into our first home. It wasn't valuable to anyone else, but to him, it was everything he couldn't afford to lose. When he passed, I kept that pouch in my bedside drawer for years. I'd touch it sometimes, especially on days when the loneliness crept in. When my son grew older, I gave it to him. It wasn't meant to be a gift. It was more like a handover. I wanted him to have something of his father that wasn't about money or success. I told him, "Keep this safe, no matter where life takes you." He had nodded, serious, maybe not understanding the weight of what I was giving him. For a while, I saw it often. It would be sitting on his desk, sometimes beside his keys, sometimes inside his car. He said it reminded him of his father. But then life changed. He got busier, started living differently. I stopped seeing it altogether. I thought maybe he'd stored it away somewhere, forgotten it like most of us forget where we come from once comfort sets in. I never imagined it would resurface like this, under the harsh light of an interrogation room, tagged and numbered as evidence in a police report. When the officer let me hold it, I could feel the faint smell of old cologne, the trace of time pressed into its fabric. My thumb brushed over the seam, and the memories came flooding back. My husband's laugh, my son as a boy running barefoot through the garden, the sound of coins clinking as the pouch hit the floor once and spilled across the tiles. I remember laughing, telling him to pick them up carefully because they were lucky coins. But there was nothing lucky about this moment. The pouch didn't just belong to my husband anymore. It was now tied to my son's disappearance, to the fear that had been clawing at me for months. When I looked inside, the first thing I saw was the old necklace I had once given my son to keep for me. It was his grandmother's. A thin gold chain with a small cross. I'd trusted him to keep it because he was always responsible, careful. Seeing it there broke something quiet inside me. It meant he hadn't lost himself completely. He had still been carrying pieces of home with him. But underneath the necklace was what truly froze me. A folded envelope, sealed, my name written across it in my son's handwriting. The edges were worn, as though he had carried it for days, maybe weeks, before leaving it behind. My heart pounded as I held it. There was no address, no date, just my name. It took me several minutes before I could bring myself to open it. The paper inside was small, his writing slightly smudged, uneven. I could tell he'd written it in a hurry, maybe while afraid, maybe while running from something. The letter was short, barely a few lines, but every word felt heavier than the last. He wrote that if I was reading it, it meant things had gone wrong. He said not to believe everything I'd hear about him, that he was trying to fix something bigger than himself. And then came the part that changed everything. "Mum, if something happens, ask for Detective Harris. He knows." I read that line over and over again until the words blurred. I didn't understand what it meant. Not yet. But I understood one thing. My son had been in danger long before he disappeared. That pouch wasn't just a sentimental keepsake anymore. It was a warning, a breadcrumb he'd left behind for me to follow. I folded the letter carefully, put it back inside the pouch, and handed it to the officer. My hands were steady now. The fear was still there, but beneath it, something else had started to grow. Purpose. That small velvet pouch, once filled with love and memories, now held the first clue to my son's truth. And as I stood there, I realized something I hadn't felt in months. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun. When I left the station that morning, I carried the pouch like it was a heartbeat. It was no longer just evidence. It was direction. My son's words kept replaying in my head. Ask for Detective Harris. He knows. That single sentence turned my fear into a task. I didn't go home right away. I sat in the car outside the station for almost an hour, staring at that envelope again, tracing my fingers over his handwriting. Every letter felt alive, heavy with urgency, but written by someone who still believed his mother could fix things. That belief both comforted and crushed me. Detective Harris. I didn't know the name, but the way my son wrote it, without a title, without formality, told me they'd spoken before. Maybe he'd trusted him. Maybe he'd helped. Or maybe he was the last person my son saw before he disappeared. When I finally went back inside to ask, the officers at the desk hesitated. "He's not on duty today," one said, avoiding my eyes. "He's on leave." That didn't sit right. Leave, in police language, can mean anything, from vacation to suspension. I gave them my number, insisted they tell him I needed to talk. Then I drove home, the pouch still on the passenger seat, the envelope back inside it. The house felt different when I walked in. Colder, quieter. It's strange how spaces change when your mind does. I made tea but didn't drink it. I just sat there, staring at the table, replaying every moment leading to that morning. I thought about my son's last visit, the one that ended with us arguing. He'd been restless that day, pacing, his phone ringing nonstop. He'd told me he was handling something big at work, something that would fix everything. I'd begged him to be careful, but he'd brushed it off. Now, sitting there, those words didn't sound like ambition. They sounded like a warning I'd missed. Late that evening, the phone rang again. This time it was Harris. His voice was steady, older, a bit weary. He asked to meet the next day. We agreed on a cafe near the station. I barely slept that night. My mind replayed 1,000 possibilities. Maybe he'd found something. Maybe my son was alive. Maybe it was worse than I dared to think. When I saw Harris the next morning, I understood why my son had trusted him. He looked tired but kind, like someone who'd seen too much but hadn't stopped caring. He didn't waste time with small talk. He told me that my son had come to him weeks before disappearing. He'd brought files, documents from his workplace showing irregular money transfers and fake accounts. The company he worked for was laundering money through offshore businesses. He'd discovered it by accident, then realized someone inside knew he'd found out. According to Harris, my son had asked for protection. But before anything official could happen, he vanished. His car was found 2 days later, the same one the police called me about. They'd never opened the pouch because they assumed it was just personal. No one knew it carried the key to everything. I listened quietly. My hands didn't shake anymore. Everything my son had done, the secrecy, the distance, even the sudden disappearance. It wasn't carelessness. It was protection. He'd been trying to shield me, to leave me a trail that only I would recognize. When Harris handed me a small folder, my breath caught. Inside were printed screenshots, bank details, and company records. My son's handwriting was on several pages, circling names and figures. At the bottom of one note, he'd written, "If anything happens to me, tell Mum. She knows where to look." I didn't, not yet, but I would. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, spreading out the documents under a lamp. My son had left me a puzzle made of numbers, names, and half-written notes. I traced each line like a prayer. One name kept appearing: Alden. It meant nothing to me then, but I knew it would soon. When I folded everything back into the pouch, the fear I'd felt for months had changed shape. It was no longer panic. It was determination. He hadn't left me a goodbye. He'd left me instructions, and now it was my turn to follow them. Detective Harris met me again 2 days later. By then, I had read every single page my son left behind. His notes, the transaction logs, even the scribbled reminders on the edges of his reports. Every line pointed to the same company, the same man, Alden & Co. I didn't know what kind of business they ran, but the money trails spoke clearly. Large transfers, fake invoices, shell accounts. When Harris sat across from me, his tone had changed. The first time he had spoken like an investigator. Now he spoke like someone who realized this wasn't just a missing person case. It was corruption, maybe even murder. He began explaining what they had found since our last meeting, the something they'd mentioned when they first called me. It wasn't just the pouch. There were documents in my son's car boot too, sealed in a waterproof file. Inside that file were printouts of company ledgers, email exchanges, and evidence of illegal transactions signed off under my son's digital ID. Whoever had framed him knew what they were doing. They'd planted the evidence to make it look like he was the one moving stolen money. My son had been set up. I listened quietly, my mind replaying every memory I had of him working late nights, every exhausted phone call where he'd said, "I'm just finishing a report." I used to think he was driven by ambition. Now I realized he was running from danger. Harris told me that my son had filed an anonymous complaint to the Financial Crimes Bureau weeks before he disappeared. That complaint never reached its destination. Someone intercepted it. The day before his car was found, the company reported him as missing after he failed to show up to work. It was too convenient, too quick. The more Harris talked, the more the puzzle came together. My son had found out that Alden, his boss, was laundering money through fake charities and overseas companies. When my son confronted him, Alden threatened to take care of it quietly. A few days later, my son vanished. The detective paused and handed me a photograph. Grainy, taken from CCTV. It showed my son's car leaving the office parking lot late at night, followed by another vehicle. The plates on the second car were traced back to Alden's assistant. That was the moment I stopped shaking. Fear had ruled me for months, but now I felt something sharper. Anger. Not wild, loud anger, cold anger. The kind that plans. I told Harris I wanted to help. He looked hesitant at first, but when I reminded him that I was the one who found the letter and the pouch, he nodded slowly. He gave me instructions. If I received any calls, emails, or contact from anyone claiming to be from the company, I was to record everything. I agreed. Then I went home and started doing what every mother knows how to do. Look for things that others miss. In my son's old desk, beneath piles of receipts and loose pens, I found a USB drive taped to the underside of the drawer. My hands trembled as I pulled it off and plugged it into my laptop. It was password protected, but he had always used one password for personal files. My birthday. It worked. Inside were folders named Insurance, Alden, and Truth. The last one contained video files. My son sat in front of his work computer, speaking into the camera. His face was tired, eyes wary, but his voice steady. He talked about how he had discovered fake accounts and had evidence linking Alden to fraudulent charities. He said he feared for his life, but couldn't stay silent. The final clip ended with him saying, "If you're watching this, it means they got to me first." I sat there for a long time, staring at the frozen image of his face on the screen. He wasn't just my son anymore. He was the key witness in something much bigger than either of us. I copied everything onto a new USB and called Harris immediately. When I met him again that night, I handed it over. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and said quietly, "You just changed this case." That night, for the first time in months, I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just sat by the window, the house quiet, the pouch beside me. I had gone from being a mother searching for her missing son to being the only person who could finish what he started. And I knew the truth they found in his car was only the beginning. The morning after handing the video evidence to Detective Harris, I woke up with a kind of calm I hadn't felt in months. Fear had done its worst, and now there was nothing left to lose, only truth to uncover. The pouch lay on my nightstand, the faint scent of old fabric reminding me that every thread of this story started in my own family. My son wasn't a criminal. He was a target, and I was going to prove it. I began by returning to his room. The air still smelled faintly of his cologne, sharp, familiar, painful. His laptop, the one I had found the USB drive in, sat closed on the desk. Next to it, piles of receipts, bills, and notes formed a small mountain of neglected order. I opened a drawer and found notebooks full of numbers and shorthand phrases I didn't understand. My son had written everything down, every transaction, every date, every anomaly. He hadn't been hiding from me. He had been protecting me. Hours passed as I turned page after page, cross-checking the names I saw with the files Detective Harris had shown me. One word kept appearing everywhere: Alden. But sometimes, in his notes, the name appeared under different aliases. There were at least 3 companies, all linked, all under Alden's control. At first, I didn't understand what any of it meant. I was a retired teacher, not an investigator. But motherhood teaches you pattern. It teaches you how to find what doesn't belong, what feels off. And what felt off here was how organized the corruption was. My son had left breadcrumbs, deliberate, precise, layered. Late that afternoon, I turned on his old phone. It was cracked, battery swollen, but it still powered on. The wallpaper was a photo of the 2 of us, years younger, smiling. It broke me for a moment. But then I noticed something else. There were dozens of unread messages. Most were from unknown numbers. One stood out. Mr. Alden. I opened it. Keep quiet. You don't want your mother dragged into this. The words felt like poison. He had used me as leverage. That was why my son disappeared. He didn't run. He withdrew to keep me safe. I immediately took screenshots and forwarded them to Harris. His reply came within minutes. We'll need that phone. You just gave us probable cause. By evening, I had gathered everything: the phone, the notes, the USB, the pouch, into one bag. But before handing it over, I searched through one last folder in his email. That's where I found something that made my hands go cold. An email draft, unsent, addressed to me. It said, "If I don't come back, remember the shed." I froze. The shed. He had used that place since he was a teenager, fixing old radios, painting, tinkering with tools. It hadn't been open since he vanished. I went outside. The evening air thick and quiet. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Dust motes floated in the fading sunlight. On the workbench sat a small metal box, locked with a keyhole. I searched every drawer, every shelf, until I found a loose floorboard under the bench. Inside was a key taped to a note. If they find the car, they'll find you. Don't let them. The lock clicked open. Inside the box were 2 things: a flash drive and a folded document stamped "Confidential, Alden & Co.'s internal records." The flash drive contained spreadsheets and signed approvals. Documents linking Alden directly to offshore accounts. The paper was a copy of a contract showing fake donations routed through a charity in my son's name. They had planned to blame him once the audit came through. He had been their scapegoat all along. When I looked at the date on the document, my stomach turned. It was stamped just 2 days before he went missing. I called Harris immediately, my voice steady. He told me not to move anything, that he'd send a team. I waited in the garden, the same place my son used to sit when he wanted advice or peace. But there was no peace that night. Only resolve. When the police arrived, I handed them the box myself. Harris looked at me and said, "You've done more than most of my team ever could." But I wasn't proud. I was furious. Furious that my son had been hunted for honesty. Furious that it took a mother's persistence to be believed. As they drove away with the evidence, I looked at the empty shed and whispered to myself, "You left me the map. I followed it." That night, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not from fear, but from the realization that my son's truth was stronger than the lies built to bury it. It took less than a week after handing over the box for everything to explode. Detective Harris called me on a Thursday morning, his voice calm, but with an edge of triumph. "We've got him," he said. Those words landed like thunder. For months, I had lived between silence and suspicion. Now there was movement, noise, and consequence. They had raided Alden's office before dawn. I wasn't there, but Harris later described it in detail. Computers were seized, safes cracked open, phones confiscated. What they found matched everything my son had left behind: forged invoices, fake charity accounts, and correspondence proving Alden's personal involvement in laundering millions. Each file carried the same digital signature my son had been accused of using. But now, it was clear those signatures had been cloned. The news reached the media within hours. "Corporate fraud ring exposed," the headlines read. I watched it on my small television, my hands shaking, tea forgotten on the table. My son's name appeared briefly, not as a suspect, but as the whistleblower who tried to stop it. That one sentence undid months of slander and erased the shame that had followed me everywhere. Later that afternoon, Harris came to see me. He was exhausted but satisfied. They had found my son, alive. He was in protective custody, thin and pale but breathing. The words didn't register at first. Alive. It felt impossible, like hearing your own heart restart. I sat down because my knees couldn't hold me. He explained that my son had gone into hiding on his own after Alden's threats became serious. He had given Harris partial evidence before disappearing, hoping to gather more proof. But Alden's men had found his car, planted documents, and made it look like he'd fled or died. The pouch, the shed, the files. They were all parts of the trail he'd left in case he never came back. He trusted me to find it because he knew I would never stop searching. When Harris left, I cried for the first time in weeks. Not soft tears, years of them. Everything inside me finally came undone. But grief didn't stay long. It was replaced by a strange peace. My son's truth had survived the lies built to bury him. 2 days later, Harris called again. "Would you like to attend the hearing?" he asked. I didn't hesitate. The courtroom was cold, too bright, too still. I sat in the back row, my hands folded in my lap, the same pouch in my purse. When they brought Alden in, he looked smaller than I remembered from the newspaper photos. Confident men often do when the world stops clapping. His lawyers spoke in circles, but the evidence was heavy and undeniable. My son's recordings, the financial data, the USB drives, all there. The judge barely needed to deliberate. Alden was charged with fraud, money laundering, and attempted extortion. The court also cleared my son's name completely. Harris caught my eye across the room and gave the smallest nod. I didn't smile. I just breathed. That was enough. When it was over, the press waited outside, shouting questions. I didn't answer any. I wasn't there for stories. I was there for closure. That night, when I returned home, the house finally felt still. Not silent, but settled. I walked into my son's old room and opened the window. The air smelled like rain and soil. I sat on his bed, clutching the pouch, and whispered into the dark, "It's done." A week later, they arranged a private meeting between me and my son. It was brief, under police supervision, but it was real. He looked thinner, older, with faint bruises fading near his jaw, but his eyes were alive. I didn't speak. Neither did he. We didn't need to. That day, I learned that sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it arrives quietly. In files, in folders, in people who don't give up. Alden's name disappeared from the news a month later. But my son's? His name started appearing in another light. As the man who exposed one of the biggest fraud cases in the region. And me? I stayed in the background, as mothers often do. But I knew the truth. None of it would have surfaced if a mother hadn't opened a pouch and refused to stop asking questions. As I sat in my garden weeks later, watching the sky darken, I thought of all the ways loss had disguised itself as strength. I had spent months looking for my son, but in truth, I was looking for proof that love could still win when everything else failed. And it did. The day they told me my son was coming home, I didn't believe it. After months of police reports, sleepless nights, and the quiet echo of fear in every corner of the house, I had forgotten what hope even felt like. But when the car pulled up that morning, and I saw him step out, thinner, paler, but standing, I knew that life had given me one last mercy. He looked different. His hair was longer, his shoulders tense, but his eyes, those same eyes that once looked at me for approval before every school test, were still there, alive, clear, cautious. When he saw me, he stopped for a moment at the gate, as if testing whether it was real. Then he smiled. Not wide, not careless, just enough to tell me he was still my son. We didn't rush to each other like they do in films. We just stood there. Sometimes love doesn't need movement. It just needs presence. I nodded. He walked forward. That was enough. Inside, everything felt too small for what we'd both survived. The living room, the table, the quiet ticking clock, all witnesses to months of waiting. He sat down slowly, looking around like someone returning from a long journey. I didn't ask where he'd been. I didn't ask what had happened. I already knew enough. The police reports, the court hearings, and the evidence had filled in the blanks. What mattered now was that he was alive to fill the silence himself. He said little at first, just small things. How they'd hidden him during the investigation. How he'd been under surveillance protection. How he'd watched the case unfold from a distance. He said he didn't reach out because it was safer that way. I listened, every word carving a new space inside me where pain used to live. When he finished, I reached into my bag and took out the pouch. The same one the police had found in his car. I placed it on the table between us. His hands trembled when he saw it. He picked it up carefully, like it might break, then looked at me. For a long moment, neither of us said a word. Then I said, "You trusted me with the truth." He didn't reply, but his eyes said everything. We spent that afternoon together, quietly, like we used to before life became complicated. He fixed the loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet, brewed tea, even smiled once or twice. I kept watching his movements, memorizing them again. Every sound, the scrape of the chair, the spoon against the cup, his soft hum while stirring, felt like life returning in fragments. When the sun began to set, we went outside to the garden. The same garden where I'd prayed every night for him to come home. The grass had grown uneven, and the roses I'd planted with him years ago had wilted. Without speaking, he knelt and began pulling out the weeds. I joined him. It felt like the simplest, purest way to begin again. He told me he wanted to rebuild, to start something honest. Maybe help others who'd been trapped by corruption like he had. I believed him. He wasn't the same boy who once chased quick money and shallow success. He was older now, rebuilt by pain, reshaped by truth. When night came, we sat on the porch. He asked if I ever doubted him. I said, "No, I doubted the world, but never you." He nodded slowly. That's when I saw the first real smile since his return. Not forced, not weak, just peace. A week later, the media tried to interview him. He refused. He didn't want fame or headlines. He wanted quiet, to live in the shadow of honesty, not noise. He started helping the investigators document corporate fraud for future cases. Harris visited once, told me my son's evidence had helped convict 3 more men involved. I thanked him. But the truth was, this victory wasn't about justice anymore. It was about survival. Now, every morning when I wake up and see him in the garden, I remind myself that love doesn't always return the way it left. Sometimes it comes back scarred, changed, quieter, but stronger. He still wears the old bracelet his father gave him, though it's worn thin now. He says it reminds him where he came from. I keep the pouch on the shelf untouched. It reminds me how far we both went to find each other again. When I look at him now, I no longer see a son who was lost. I see a man who was found, not by chance, but by truth. The garden is quiet now. The weeds are gone, the soil dark and soft, the air filled with the slow hum of life returning. My son is outside, fixing the wooden fence that had leaned for years. I sit by the window with a cup of tea, the same way I did every morning during the months he was missing, except now the silence doesn't hurt. It heals. It's strange how everything can change without making a sound. The house looks the same. Same walls, same clock, same chair where I prayed every night. But the weight inside it is different. Before, it was full of waiting. Now, it's full of proof that truth always finds a way home, even if it crawls back in pieces. When the police first called that day, "Ma'am, we found something in your son's car," I thought my world had ended. I had imagined the worst, planned for grief, and buried my faith under fear. But now, months later, I understand that call wasn't the end. It was the start of the truth digging its way out of lies. I look at the pouch on the shelf, the same one they found in his car. It sits there like a relic, quiet but alive. It doesn't hold money or secrets or power anymore. It holds faith, the kind that survives even when you stop believing in it. My son doesn't talk much about what happened. Sometimes, when I ask, he just shakes his head and says, "It's over." I don't press. Some pain doesn't need words, but every night when he double-checks the locks, I know the fear still lingers. I let him. Healing doesn't have deadlines. The neighbors still whisper. They say things like, "It's a miracle he came back," or "She must have gone through hell." They're right, but they'll never really understand. Because surviving isn't about luck. It's about endurance. It's about not giving up when the world tells you to accept what doesn't feel right. When I think about those first weeks, the sleepless nights, the empty chair, the unanswered calls, I realize how close I came to breaking. There were days when I stopped eating, stopped moving, stopped caring. But a mother doesn't get to surrender. Even when there's no proof, no sign, no sound, she keeps searching. That's what saved me. That stubborn kind of love that refuses to close the door until it knows what's really on the other side. People often talk about justice like it's loud, like it arrives in sirens and gavel strikes. But I've learned it's quieter than that. It comes in files, in signatures, in the tired faces of those who don't stop digging. It doesn't shout. It waits until the noise dies down and then stands on its own. Now, when I walk through the house, I feel my husband's absence less as loss and more as reminder. He used to say, "Truth is like water. It finds its way." He was right. It took time, pain, and patience, but it found us. Sometimes I wonder how many other mothers are out there, sitting by windows, waiting for phone calls, holding on to hope that the world keeps telling them to let go of. I wish I could tell them what I learned. that no matter how quiet the night gets, no matter how many people stop believing, truth has its own kind of loyalty. It may hide, but it never leaves. As I sit here watching my son repair the fence, I think of how close I came to losing him. Not just to danger, but to lies. And I realize something simple. Love doesn't save people by protecting them from the world. It saves them by believing in them when no one else does. When I glance up, he waves, just once. I wave back. We don't need to say anything. The story is finished, but the life it left behind is still being written. Every day we wake up and choose peace over fear. The police found something in his car, yes. But what they really found was proof that even in the darkest moments, a mother's love doesn't wait for permission to act. Now, when I hear a phone ring in the early morning, I don't flinch anymore. I just breathe. Because I know that not every call brings bad news. Some calls bring closure. Some bring light. So, if you're watching this, if you've ever waited for a call that froze your heart, remember this. Sometimes what's found isn't loss. Sometimes it's the truth that finally comes home.